Well, welcome everybody. I'm excited to start my fifth of my live stream video series for 2018. And the topic today is, of course, one of my favorites, on embracing abundance mentality and getting rid of your poverty mentality. So a few things to note. One is you all should have received a discussion guide if you subscribe to this, so hopefully you have that. If not, email me afterwards and I'll make sure you get a copy of it. And secondly, there are questions. You have the opportunity to ask questions live, and I will attempt to answer them live. There's a Q&A button toward the bottom of your screen, so feel free to type in any questions you have, and I'll periodically try to check on them and answer them. And of course, if you have any other questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out. So today I want to cover a few topics with you, and I have them listed all here on my fancy technology, as you see my easel paper. Today I want to do a few things. The first is to define what we mean by a poverty and an abundance mentality. And then secondly and thirdly, to share with you some manifestations, how a poverty mentality manifests itself in philanthropy, and how an abundance mentality manifests itself in philanthropy, and share lots of examples of how this is happening in real time with foundations. The fourth is to tell you a little bit about why poverty mentality happens in philanthropy, and in particular, why it's a problem for us as a field. The fifth is to have some fun by testing your poverty mentality, and then lastly, giving you some suggestions of what you can do about it. So in my experience, I've been advising and consulting to foundations and high net worth donors for the past 20 years, with probably, 80 or so organizations and individuals. And in my experience, truly, the thing that holds funders back the most from achieving the impact they want is they have an abundance mentality, they have a poverty mentality and not an abundance mentality. And I think what's important to recognize is that a poverty mentality, or it's also referred to as a scarcity mentality, has really very little to do with wealth or money. It has everything to do with mindset. And I like the juxtaposition of poverty mentality in philanthropy because, of course, as funders, if we have nothing else, we have access to money. And so I think no one really thinks about having a poverty mentality, but in fact, as you'll see today, it's unfortunately very much alive in the field. So I want to share with you my screen and define what I'm talking about with a poverty mentality. So I view this as funders that have a poverty mentality believe that internal investment is only warranted when the need is urgent. And by internal, I mean internal to your foundation or your organization, or perhaps to your grantees. That opportunities are limited by your current capacity. Improvement is always incremental. We should always seek to do more with less. And we don't deserve, and I use the word deserve here intentionally, we don't deserve the best, fastest, or most efficient path to success. One of the questions that I know was asked earlier was, what causes a poverty mentality? And I believe that a poverty mentality is really, at the end of the day, caused by fear. And I'll be talking at my next live stream on October 30th about overcoming fear in philanthropy, so we'll address this more then. But a poverty mentality is really driven by fear, and in particular, a fear of failure. And also a misguided belief that maintaining a Spartan operation automatically equates to delivering greater value for your grantees and the communities that you're seeking to serve. By contrast, funders that have an abundance mentality recognize that the goal of philanthropic stewardship is about effectiveness and impact and not thrift, that we deserve to make investments in ourselves, in our organizations, in order to achieve our missions and to achieve the impact that we want to have and the greatest outcomes. That really it's investing in the people, the technology, the systems, the capacity in ourselves that really advances our philanthropic mission, and therefore advances the work of our grantees and the communities we serve. That opportunities that come to us are reasons to grow our capacity, that advances can be made in leaps and bounds, success can be replicated and improved upon, and that we can handle most situations, or we can certainly bounce back quickly if we have challenges, right? So that to me is an abundance mentality. It essentially means the more you put into life, the more you get out of life, right? Now, this is not what I mean when I say an abundance mentality. What I don't mean is an indulgence mentality. I don't mean that you need to send your board on first-class flights to exotic locations for luxurious board retreats, or that you need to, spend gobs of money on redoing your office or whatever it might be, right? It's an abundance mentality, not an indulgence mentality. Now, of course, indulgence is lovely, and who wouldn't want to be here, right, at this lovely castle? But that's not what we're talking about today. And then just say, really, I think that on the most basic level, philanthropy has offered a lot of freedom. And it's really funders that have the most wherewithal to embrace an abundance mentality compared to most fields, right? We don't have a lot of government oversight. We're not accountable to shareholders. We're unfortunately really not accountable to our grantees. I don't agree that should be the case, but I think it's realistically the case. Yet I think despite all this freedom to be abundant, funders really squander the freedom because we really use a poverty mentality. We kind of put it upon ourselves, and it hijacks our ability to be effective and impactful. Okay, so now I want to share with you 10 manifestations of a scarcity mentality. And I have it, it's funny, I was laughing to myself earlier that this technology of the easel paper is not exactly fancy, but at the same time it sure does work well. There's rarely technical difficulties, right? So manifestations of a poverty mentality, I think that there's 10. You might think of more. And although I do strongly believe that a poverty or scarcity mentality is a mindset, it's really about attitudes and beliefs and not about money. A lot of the manifestations are related to lack of investment, either lack of financial investment in something or investment of our time or our smarts. So the first 5 of these I think are more investment related. So I'm going to talk about lack of investment in technology, staff, capacity, collaboration, and grant funding, and then other poverty mentality mindsets that erupt in philanthropy relating to bureaucracy, thinking small, the never-ending planning process, lack of exposure to new ideas, and lack of self-care. So those are the things I'm going to talk to you about right now. And you can kind of follow along and track where I am. The first is technology. As probably most of you listening in have heard by now, there's been a lot of controversy with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. It is one of the largest, if not the largest, foundations in the US right now, with billions and billions of dollars in assets. And they have had a scandal recently related to a toxic organizational culture that involved bullying and sexual harassment and lots of other very stressful situations, such that the CEO and at least two senior leaders have left the organization, and it's been all over the media. Now, it's interesting to me because they had a law firm recently did an assessment to ascertain if the allegations were true and make recommendations to the organization as to what they could do to improve. And this is available online, and I was really stunned, quite frankly, to see. I read through all the recommendations, and a lot of them were related to technology. Because a lot of the staff had been complaining that they were overburdened and overworked, in part because the technology within the organization was so poor. And I'd heard that actually from other funders that had been seeking to partner with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. But this law firm determined that the foundation should assess its core technology across all divisions, improve the training and utilization of existing technology, look for alternatives to what their technology in the marketplace, assess improvements that can be made, and ensure that all staff are provided with efficient tools to complete their work. Now, I found this stunning because, again, poverty mentality is not about wealth. This is perhaps the wealthiest foundation in the country, if not among the top in the world. They're in Silicon Valley, right? So they have access to technology. I mean, this is an organization that truly, if you walked out the front door, picked up a stone and threw it, chances are you would hit somebody who had the technological expertise to improve what was going on within the foundation, right? You're in Silicon Valley. They received gobs of money from the tech millionaires and billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg, right? So to me, it's just stunning that an organization that well positioned, I mean, this should be a model for amazing technology in a foundation, right? That they weren't investing in themselves, that they had a poverty mentality that said that our staff and our work and our donors and our grantees don't deserve the best technology. Another example is about staff, and I see this all the time, a lack of investment in staff to ensure there's adequate staff capacity and leadership to do the work. And what you have often is foundations where you have senior leaders whose job it is to set strategy, organize their teams to implement strategy, think 5 years down the line, anticipate problems, leverage relationships, create initiatives, identify opportunities for social change that they can take advantage of, all kinds of things, right? But what are they doing instead? They are taking meeting minutes, and then they're editing those minutes, and then they're disseminating the meeting minutes to whoever came to the meeting. They are filling out travel reimbursement forms. They're scheduling the caterer to come to meetings and then meeting the caterer at the door, right? All of these activities that there's nothing wrong with them, they're important work that has to be done, but not the best use of time of those senior leaders, right, who are making probably among the most money in the organization. A family foundation CEO that I know once told me, Chris, we don't hire consultants, we don't need consultants, we're fine. Well, meanwhile, back at the ranch, if you look at his staff, they're exhausted, right? They're burning, the candle at both ends. They are, one particular program officer there, she has a whole grant portfolio. She's launching new initiatives. She's leveraging all of her contacts. She's traveling to the state capitol and to Washington, D.C. to try to draw down additional funding for the work that she's doing. And she's working from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. She hardly takes vacations, and she's exhausted. And unfortunately, right now, she's also battling a life-threatening illness. Now, I can't say, of course, that the two are necessarily related, but working yourself ragged is certainly not helpful to one's health and really not helpful to the work of the organization. But this CEO, I think, has a poverty mentality saying, we're just going to work our staff to the bone because they seem to be doing great work and it's fine, and not investing, even in a little bit of help. An admin, she shares a part-time admin, but she can't even count on that person to schedule her meetings effectively. So it's really not very helpful. Organizational capacity is another example. I was working with an organization that organizes donors, organizes high net worth donors to try to encourage them to give their money away toward progressive causes. So this organization wanted to triple the number of donors that were members in its organization and dramatically influence how those donors allocated their funding to these progressive causes. So those are two, great goals that are doable. However, the organization had no idea what % of money these donors currently were allocating to these progressive causes. They didn't know how much influence they currently had on these donors, nor did they know what barriers these donors might find in trying to increase their funding toward these progressive causes. So they wanted to get this to this desired future state of dramatically more donors and dramatically more influence over how that money is allocated. They had no idea what their current state was. And they balked at the idea of spending any money to research, to conduct research. There was a suggestion of spending about $75,000 to do that research to help them understand where are you now, what's the best way to get to where you want to go. But the CEO said, no, we're too small of an organization, we're just a small nonprofit, we really can't afford it. And to me, this is an example of a poverty mentality for a number of reasons. One, not willing to make this investment to something that's of strategic importance to the organization. Secondly, it's ultimately wasting staff time because her strategy then was, our staff can figure it out. Well, maybe they can, but maybe they can't. Just because you're a good, let's say, program officer doesn't mean that you're a good researcher or that you're good at other kinds of work that needs to be done. So that's, I think a waste of staff time ultimately. And also I think it's an aspect of fear. I talked about fear being a really important part of having a poverty mentality. And I think she felt safer in this ambiguous zone, right? If she had the actual data that she needed, she might learn, gosh, we're not as influential as we thought we were. And if she actually has to track her ability to meet these goals, she might learn that she isn't making as much progress as she thought. So it's actually safer for her to be less clear and just sort of hope for the best. And that to me is a poverty mentality. All right, the third is around collaboration. Now, a good thing, I think, is that in the past few decades, there's been a lot more collaboration among foundations. I remember one of my first consulting projects, like 19 years ago, was with the Charles and Helen Schwab Foundation. And we were trying to partner with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on some work around substance abuse treatment. And I remember finding online a single chapter in a book that was about funder collaboration and being ecstatic, like, oh my God, I can't believe there's actually literature about this and someone's thinking about this, right? Well, now there's gobs of information about effective funder collaboration, but one thing that's really important is that you resource it, right? This stuff just doesn't happen. People need to come together, often have differing opinions and perspectives. They need to create a shared common goal and strategies, be clear on the roles and responsibilities, hold people accountable, communicate, track progress, all kinds of stuff, right? It needs to be resourced. So I was working with a foundation collaboration that was trying to increase preschool, high quality access to preschool in a community. Well, there were a couple funders involved, and an opportunity came to this initiative, which was the possibility of drawing down $5 million in federal funding. But we had to act really quickly. And we recognized that we needed to create an event, basically, that would bring in the Secretary of Education at the federal level, the mayor of that city, the governor of that state, lots of local policymakers and opinion leaders and high net worth donors. And it had to happen within 3 weeks when the Secretary of Education was coming to town. So we recognized we needed to hire like a really smart event planner who knew about political fundraising and who knew this community and was available to start like tomorrow and be available for the next 3 weeks to work almost exclusively on this project. Not an easy task, right? So one of the funders was doing all kinds of work. She was really doing all the work to try to make all this happen and find this, mystical person. Well, shockingly, we found the perfect person who was available and talented and fabulous and charged $10,000 for the work, which I thought was reasonable. It's about $100 an hour, which is pretty inexpensive for a consultant. That was, Funder A. Funder B, which was a bank, had agreed all along, yes, this is a great idea, we'll split the cost. When they learned that they had to pay $5,000, they backed out. They said, oh no, that's too much money. We're out. So it left the whole project scrambling because it had this short window of time. Now, to me, that's a poverty mentality for a lot of reasons. One, you can't recognize that a $5,000 investment is worth it if it could leverage $5 million or even $1 million or $500,000, right? To me, that's worth it. They had the money. That was not a problem. But second of all, it was a poverty mentality in that she was willing to squander the relationship. Collaborations are based on relationships of trust among people. And if she was willing to kind of just, toss aside her money and force this other funder to continue scrambling and continue working really hard to make all this happen, to me that was disrespectful and an example of a poverty mentality. All right, and the last area is around grant funding related to investments related to poverty mentality. So a couple examples, of course, I think it's a poverty mentality when a funder insists that a nonprofit can only have up to a maximum amount of overhead, like 10% or 12% can be for overhead, regardless of what the nonprofit is trying to accomplish and what kind of overhead it might actually need. Funders that refuse, they'll fund programs, but they won't fund the staff to implement the program. So they'll fund a training program, but won't actually pay the salary of the trainer. Or they'll fund an advocacy endeavor, but they won't fund the advocate to travel to the state capitol to, talk to legislators, right? Because they don't want the organization to be dependent on funding. Well, to me, that's a poverty mentality. Or they expect results. They want to see the impact, but they won't fund the evaluation itself so that the organization can find out what its impact actually is. Or they refuse to fund multi-year grants. There's lots of reasons why offering an organization multiple years of funding up front is beneficial. I mean, number one, they don't have to spend their time fundraising. They can spend their time actually helping people. But also, it allows them to really hire the best talent. I was interviewing a nonprofit grantee once for a foundation client who really appreciated that this foundation gave them 3 years of funding because it allowed her to hire the best person that she wanted to hire for the job. That particular individual was working someplace else, was a single mom, but had a good job, good salary, and benefits. And she just she liked the woman and wasn't willing to try to get her to come work for her if it was only for a 1-year gig, right? She wouldn't want to risk that woman and her family's financial security, not knowing if she'd have the money for years 2 or 3. So if she only had a year of funding, she would have hired a less talented person, probably a younger person with less experience, who wouldn't mind the 1-year opportunity, wouldn't be fearful of it. So the multi-year funding really allowed, it was an abundance approach, it allowed the organization to do its best work. Okay, so the next few I think are really about more of a mindset of a poverty mentality. I'm going to go through them a little bit faster, just in the interest of time. And the first, or the sixth, I guess, is bureaucracy. I think funders need to recognize that we create bureaucracy for ourselves. I mean, for the most part. Certainly there's, tax law and federal law you have to follow and state law. But for the most part, we create our own bureaucracy. And I think it takes a mindset shift to recognize that we can actually undo it. And I'm going to share my screen with you again. And this, to me, is a great example of bureaucracy and philanthropy. We tie ourselves up in bureaucracy. We create policies, systems, processes, rules, whatever, and it holds us back. It prevents us from being effective and taking advantage of opportunities. We trap ourselves. But it's very easy to untrap yourselves, because if you created something, you can get rid of it if you just try. I mean, and it doesn't really cost money. This gentleman in this picture here, all he really needs is a pair of scissors to get out of his bureaucracy, right? And in philanthropy, you really don't need that much more. There's lots of examples of this. I mean, I know one foundation where they require 5 different people to approve a $5,000 grant. And one of those people has to actually approve it twice on 2 different occasions, which is ridiculous. And I want to share another story with you that I think is a really fun and interesting example of bureaucracy related to using RFPs to hire consultants. Now, I don't really respond to very many requests for proposals, RFPs, because most of my business comes through direct referrals, repeat business, or people just contacting me because they want to work with me specifically. But a lot of funders use this tool, and I think it's an example of a poverty mentality, because I think it's based in fear and based on a belief that, A, we're not sure we can find the right talent, so we're going to cast it out a net to thousands of people and see what we get. And we're not worried about how much of our own time we're wasting or how much of other people's time that we're wasting. And we're just not sure that we haven't invested in our own ability to identify consultants and identify talent that we can turn to when we need it. So a particular foundation approached me recently to do some strategic planning work, and they had issued it as an RFP, and they sent it out to all kinds of listservs across the United States. I mean, I saw it show up in my inbox multiple times. And they received, not surprisingly, 30 proposals from 30 different consultants to do the work. Now, as you might know from past episodes, I like to kind of do the math and show how, bureaucracy in action, what it really means in terms of time and money. So this is my estimate of what it took for this organization to do this work. So certainly they had to write the RFP, right, before they could send it out. And I'm guessing that took about 2 days or 16 hours, because it was a beautifully written RFP. And I know they had lots of back and forth with their board to get there. Then they had to disseminate it, send it to these various organizations to disseminate on their listservs. That was a couple hours. They offered to talk to potential consultants. So I'm guessing that of the 30 that applied, maybe half, conservatively, wanted to talk to them for an hour each. That's 15 hours. Then that CEO now has to read 30 proposals. I'm guessing that's going to be a half hour each, which I think is conservative. So 15 hours of pure proposal reading. Then he's going to spend about a day figuring out which are his top 6 proposals he wants to move forward. He then likely will want to get someone else's perspective. So bring in his vice president, who will then read those 6 for a half hour each. Then they'll summarize their recommendations for the board, which are their top 3. They'll interview those top 3. Even if it's a phone interview with scheduling and preparing and follow-up and whatnot, that's about 6 hours. Take a couple hours to make a decision. That's 72 hours of staff time just to deal with selecting a consultant for a project. And if you assume that person makes $100,000 a year, add 25% for benefits, divide that by the number of working hours a year, and yada, 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 you get $60 an hour times 74 hours. That's $4,400 that was spent. If this is probably a $50,000 project, they've already spent 1/10 of the project fee just in like futzing around, right? Now, even worse, I think, is if you look down at the bottom here, the consultant time. So now you have 30 different consultants or consulting firms writing proposals. I'll say conservatively, they spend a day each, 8 hours each. So now you've spent, or consultants have spent 240 hours. That's 6 weeks of wasted consultant time, right? Because only one's going to get hired. Imagine what you could do with 240 hours of smart consultants working on something, right? If you brought them all together for a day and had them try to tackle a problem, they probably would figure out a whole solution and a whole implementation plan, right? Or if you just hired a consultant, in 6 weeks they could get the whole project done. They'd be done by now. So this is just, to me, a big waste of time for all involved. Okay, great. So then, moving quickly through the last three, I think thinking small. You know, when you think small, you end up with small outcomes. You have small goals, small outcomes. When you think big, you can have much bigger outcomes and bigger goals. I was talking with a foundation leader who wanted to end or dramatically reduce youth violence in her community. And she thought she was being very strategic, but she was doing it by making, I don't know, 20 small grants of like $10,000 each to 20 different organizations with no sense of how they were working together or anything, right? So she was thinking very small, and consequently the outcome of all that funding was going to be very small. Never-ending planning is the 8th. This is, you know, planning processes that go on, strategic plans that are anticipated to take a year or 2 years. Never-ending research, you know, kind of like it's spending more months and talking to more people and doing more surveys and whatnot to figure out what your strategy is going to be. I'm a believer that if you're 80% there, you move. You know, if you're 80% clear on what you need to do, just go for it, right? Because you'll figure that 20% out along the way, and you have confidence that you'll make course corrections as you need them. I'm not saying that you should be winging it and just kind of making it up as you go, but I am saying you don't need to write a dissertation in order to launch a new grant-making initiative. The 9th is lack of exposure to new ideas and viewpoints. So one example of this is I've done a lot of work in youth development. And in youth development, as you might know too, a lot of it's about exposing people and young people to new opportunities. So kids whose parents have never gone to college and like hardly anyone graduates from high school where they go to school, exposing them to college campuses and what that means and how it feels and how you can get into college. Those exposure opportunities are really important. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and we're right on Lake Erie, which is one of the biggest lakes in the world. And there are kids in Cleveland who never get out of their neighborhood and literally don't know that Lake Erie is there. And so exposing them, like taking them to the lake, I don't know, 5 miles away, 2 miles away, is a big deal. Right, so I think also in philanthropy, we don't really expose ourselves to different viewpoints and different ways of thinking. And especially with social media and how we get our news fed to us, we kind of get fed what we already believe, right? So you have to work hard to really expose yourself to new ways of thinking. I was really lucky. Last week I was invited to the home of former President of the US, H.W. Bush, in Kennebunkport to meet with some of his family and a lot of the leaders in an organization he helped to start called the Points of Light. And it's all about bipartisanship. And there were people there representing multiple different viewpoints, multiple different political perspectives, but all focused on the end goal of the importance of civic engagement of citizens in ensuring a healthy democracy. And so it was a fabulous opportunity to hear different perspectives and different political perspectives, all focused on the same end goal. And I think we need more of that in philanthropy. And the 10th, excuse me, is a lack of self-care. And you might have seen Beth Kanter has done a lot of work on this, the importance of self-care among nonprofit employees. But I think too often in philanthropy we sacrifice our own health, our sleep, our time with our kids, all in service of the work that we're doing. And I think we have a belief that we don't deserve to take care of ourselves fundamentally. And we have a belief that taking care of ourselves isn't necessarily going to lead to organizational outcomes. And in fact, I think it does. Okay, so that's examples of a poverty mentality. Now I want to share with you examples of an abundance mentality. And you'll see some of the same categories. So I'm going to talk about, again, technology and capacity, staffing, also learning, sharing the wealth, agility, which I see as the opposite of bureaucracy, innovation, and risk. Those are the 8, I guess, manifestations I want to talk about. Again, abundance mentality is believing that you deserve to make investments in yourselves because ultimately that will help you meet your mission of and have an impact. Seeing opportunities as a reason to grow, and advances can be made in leaps and bounds. So technology. One of the examples I want to share with you is actually an abundance example with the California Health Care Foundation, which I know we have some subscribers here from the California Health Care Foundation, so I'd ask you to hold me accountable, except that I can't hear you. But they're a great example. They have, or at least had, a process called a peer review process. And this is a way for the foundation to ensure that the strongest grants are made, the best grants are made, they have the best likelihood of success, and a way to weed out potential grants that are not going to be likely to be successful. And it's also an abundance mentality because it's a belief that all staff in the organization are super talented and smart and can contribute to the advancement of any different goal. This is a health foundation, so they're all about health. But like most foundations, they have separate program areas within that overall umbrella of health. And most foundations can be very siloed. We focus on access to care, we focus on quality of care, we focus on technology in healthcare, and never the twain shall meet. Well, this foundation found a way to break through that and leverage the smarts of all of its staff. So they have a process where as large grants are being brought forward for consideration, all staff have an opportunity to review the project and provide feedback and guidance, support, recommendations, whatever, to strengthen it, and sometimes to say, this is probably not going to be successful. And this is helpful because, you might have a new program officer who's putting forth a grant, wants to make a grant, that will engage the State Department of Health. But that person might not have worked with the state yet in this work. But their staff, their colleagues have, right? They have lots of experience doing that. So their colleagues can say, well, in my experience, you need to make sure this is in place, make sure you talk to this person, involve these people in order to make it successful, right? That's tremendously helpful and can advance the work. And there's a technology component behind all of this to make, behind the scenes to make all of this happen, that the foundation has intensively invested in at different points over time to make sure that that back end of technology to support all those comments and that sharing and the feedback works really smoothly. So I think that's a great example of an abundance mentality. Go California Healthcare Foundation. All right, so capacity is another one. I talked about the importance of supporting collaborations, especially with capacity. So my one example is with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation in Arkansas, 2 education funders with somewhat different perspectives on education, but came together to recognize that no matter what we believe, K through 12 education in Arkansas needs to be dramatically improved and reformed. And brought together all the stakeholders in education, teachers, principals, superintendents, the Board of Education, the State Department of Education, et cetera, to figure out, what could we do together to dramatically improve. I think Arkansas was like 48th of all the states in the US in terms of educational outcomes. How can we dramatically improve that? And what they recognized was, we can't do this alone. We need a partner to help us, somebody that can help shepherd these discussions with a diverse range of stakeholders, that can conduct some research, facilitate decision making, summarize our recommendations, kind of pull this group together. And the staff, again, talented, but already busy with full-time jobs and not necessarily trained in facilitating decision making, right? So they infused resources and brought in an organization to help facilitate this work because they really believed in the outcome. A different example of supporting capacity is having an abundance approach that says, yeah, maybe the system isn't working here, but we have a lot of existing capacity that is doing well if it was better organized and brought together. And so building on existing capacity is, I think, an abundance approach, which is what the Cleveland Foundation did when it launched a youth development initiative. So it recognized, for example, that while there was no youth development system, there were lots of great after-school programs all over the county doing great work in isolation, and no one knew how to find them. So they funded efforts to identify them all and put them all in a searchable database, so you as a parent could find an after-school program that worked on the arts with middle schoolers that you could drive to, right? And then went about trying to build their capacity and improve the quality of all of these after-school programs and coordinate them so that they knew each other and they could make referrals to each other and begin to build a system. But it all started with an abundance mindset of, we have a lot of strengths, let's identify those strengths and build upon them first. Staffing, another example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was launching a pretty large initiative to support young men and boys of color. Did a lot of outreach and were stunned to receive 1,200 proposals for 10 grants that they were going to give away, right? It was the largest number of grants received for any initiative of that foundation in 40 years. They'd planned on managing all in-house with their existing staff and recognized, we really can't do this anymore. We need to bring in outside reinforcements to make sure this works well. This is really important, and it's worth the investment to make sure that we can get down, from 1,200 down to 20 is not necessarily an easy task. And so brought in the staff capacity that they needed to make sure they could get that job done well. The fourth area is around learning, and we've talked before about the importance of intentional learning and creating a culture of learning in an organization. The Barr Foundation in Boston, I think, is a great example of abundance. They underwent strategic planning a few years ago, and under the leadership of their CEO, Jim Canales, they decided, hey, let's share with our community and our grantees and the world what we're learning while we're learning it, what we're thinking about while we're thinking about it in terms of our new strategies moving forward. And they had a whole series of blog posts where they shared what they were doing in real time to get feedback and ideas from people. Again, a poverty mentality would say, we can't let anyone know what's going on. We're fearful that they might get mad at us if we don't fund their issue, so we'll just keep it all behind closed doors and announce it when it's all said and done and with a bow tied around it. And abundance approach is, hey, this might be risky, but it's worth it to get feedback and be transparent about what we're doing. For corporate funders, you might be interested in this approach, what I call sharing the wealth. The Blue Shield of California, the health insurance company, which is actually a nonprofit organization, a couple years ago had a $180 million net profit and decided to give it back. So they actually gave a lot of it back to their existing members, people who buy insurance through them. But also they set aside $20 million to fund what are called accountable care organizations, which is just a fancy way of saying better ways to integrate physicians and hospitals and health insurance providers so that there's better use of data across, of the patients and better outcomes for those patients. And they did it by offering grant funds to their competitors. This is a competitive environment of health insurance, obviously. So hospitals, for-profit, not-for-profit, other health insurance providers, for-profit, not-for-profit, could apply for funding and receive funding. To me, this is an abundance approach because they kept their eyes on the prize. The prize was better healthcare and outcomes for Californians. And they weren't worried about the competition and what that might do in terms of their own bottom line. Agility, again, the opposite of bureaucracy. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation takes other when they're making core operating support grants, they will often not require a proposal. They will allow the organization, the nonprofit, to submit their annual report and their audited financial statement, and that constitutes the proposal, and they'll get funding that way. This is for grants of several $100,000 up to $1 million. Right? So imagine if a huge foundation was able to eliminate so many bureaucratic hurdles that they're willing to do that and trust their staff to do that and trust their grantees and the relationships they have. Imagine what you could do with your $5,000 or $10,000 or $25,000 grants, right? It really gives you some perspective. The last two I just want to gloss over briefly. I think it's important for funders to create a culture of innovation. That's a good manifestation of an abundance mentality. And really thinking about what are the conditions necessary that we need to create in our organizations to foster innovation, and similarly risk-taking, and ensuring that the foundation is taking prudent risk. And when funders do that, I think it really adds a lot of value to the work that they're doing, and it's a good demonstration of an abundance mindset. So I just want to look at a few questions. One question is, what role does organizational culture play in having a poverty or an abundance mentality? And that's a great question. I think, you know, an organizational culture is a set of beliefs that guide behavior. And that's manifested, the beliefs are held by people, and the behavior is done by people, right? It's people comprise organizations. And you think about the people involved and the systems, the structures that bring them together, and the processes, the way they work together, that's all about organizations. And so if you have individuals, or everyone in the organization, or many people in the organization exhibiting a poverty mentality, then I think that infuses across the whole culture of the organization. And certainly when you have a CEO who has a poverty mentality, you know, like with any kind of organizational culture issue, you know, that really trickles down across the whole organization. So that's a really important thing to think about. Another question is, do you see a difference between an RFP and a targeted RFP, 3 to 5 consultants? We see the risk of never using an RFP, that you're always pulling from the same pool of people. That's a good point. And an RFP is a chance to get to know who's out there, what they can do, and different perspectives in the problem you're trying to solve. Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually have an article. I wrote an article called something like, I don't know, don't use RFPs, find other great ways to hire fabulous consultants, or something like that. I'll send it out to you. But I think if you, as long as you, I think it's important for funders to kind of continuously source consultants. I mean, I do this in my own consulting firm because I hire subcontractors. I'm always on the lookout for good, talented people to keep on my radar screen. So I think that's an important use of your time. Certainly issuing it to a fewer number of people is a good thing, but I think it's more important. I mean, I'd rather, as a consultant, have a foundation come to me and say, look, we're talking to 2 other people, let's sit down for lunch, let's talk about this and brainstorm some ideas, I'd love to hear your perspective on it, and then I'll let you know if I want you to submit a proposal. That to me is a better use of my time. I don't mind giving away my ideas to anybody, a funder, but forcing people to kind of come up with lengthy proposals and then kind of pulling ideas from each of them, and then giving them all to, you know, the one consultant that you select, to me that's sketchy at best. It's unfair, and to me it's more of a poverty mentality. I think figuring out how you as a funder can work with consultants, view them as partners, trusted peers, and kind of collectively come up with the best approach to the work, it's a better use of everybody's time. Another question, I have an abundance approach myself, but many of my colleagues have a scarcity mentality. How do I counter their negativity and their poverty mentality? So that's a great question. So you're perfect, right? It's everyone else around you that isn't so great, right? No, I understand that. I think it's really kind of, when someone comes to you that says things like, you know, that's too risky, you just swing it right back at them and say, no, actually, it might be risky, but let's figure out how we can take prudent risk. Or if they say, we don't have enough money, you say, okay, fair, but how can we leverage more money? Who else could we engage in this process to bring in more resources? Or what's our return on investment going to be to make it worth it? Or can we maybe start small, at a small scale, and generate some proof that something is going to work, and then begin to get more investment into it? So I think it's recognizing that poverty mentality the moment it happens, and saying, aha, this is an opportunity to be abundant, let's swing this around, and how would we answer it if we were fully embracing abundance? How would we address this? And I think that's a really good way to approach it. Okay. So why does this happen? Why does a poverty mentality happen in philanthropy? I think it happens for 5 reasons. The first is fear, as I mentioned, so I won't go into that too much. The second is a herd mentality. So I think, when we see poverty, we sort of experience a poverty mentality all around us, it is hard to recognize that it doesn't have to be that way, right? When you believe you're doing the right thing because you're experiencing a poverty mentality all around you. So you sort of think it's normal, you normalize it, and then that's what you kind of go with. The third, as I showed you with the man stuck behind all that red tape, is we entrap ourselves in bureaucracy. I mean, to the extent that we can't even think straight, right? We can't even think our way out of it. We're so stuck in, it's going to take 4 months to make a grant, so therefore I can't fund this amazing policy opportunity that needs to happen in the next month. As opposed to saying, how do we undo the processes that require us to have a minimum of 4 months before we can make a grant? The fourth is, I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're too busy dealing with the effects of a poverty mentality that we can't think of anything else to do. So, I mean, quite literally, if you're working 100 hours a week, or let's just say, 70, you're too exhausted, really, to think about how could we revamp our entire operation to streamline our work and be more effective at how we go about it, or how do we embrace an innovative culture, and how do we set up conditions for that, right? Because you're so immersed in your poverty approach that it's hard to do anything differently. And then last, I think it's true that I think funders really equate philanthropic stewardship with thrift. People are very mindful that we have these assets, especially if they're not your assets, you're the professional staff of a foundation. You feel a responsibility to make sure that they grow and exist in perpetuity, if that's how the foundation's set up. But equating that with thrift, like fear of spending anything and making investments, I think is misguided. I think it's actually the opposite approach. It's the opposite that's true, that it's a good use of resources to make investments in yourself to ensure that the organization is successful. All right, so why is this a problem? Poverty mentality is a problem for a lot of reasons, and of course I have 5. The first is that it costs a lot of time and money, right? You think you're saving money, but in fact you're wasting money. So for example, if you are not investing in proper strategic planning and thoughtful strategic planning, and you're not clear on your strategy, then it's very easy, as we've discussed before, to get lost on bandwagon byways and just kind of get taken off course and travel, finding different ideas and whatnot. And I do want to just make a point of saying we're past time, but since I had some technological difficulties, I'm just going to continue and finish the full live video. And if you have to jump off, I understand, but I'll certainly send you the recorded version so that you have that and you can watch it at your leisure. If the California Healthcare Foundation had not invested in that peer review process and taken the time and spent the money, I can guarantee you they would have made a lot more bad grants, right? They just would have. It wouldn't have been as smart. I mean, they're very smart. They wouldn't have been as smart, and they wouldn't have been as successful about going about doing it. The second is, the pace of change is dramatically speedier in this century than it has been in the past. And I think foundations really need to keep up with that pace of change. And that requires being adaptable, efficient, focusing on building relationships, addressing systems and policy changes kind of pretty rapidly. And that really requires a mentality of abundance. You're not going to get that with a poverty mentality, and you're not going to get that with, so many foundations these days are trapped in this sort of Depression-era approach of, we're just going to make grants. It's very transactional and not transformational. And I think that in order to stay abreast of what's happening rapidly in real time today, you must have an abundance approach of agility and speed and belief in yourself and your talented staff. The third reason why a poverty mentality is a problem is that it spreads, right? And especially spreads to grantees. I mean, it will spread from the CEO down to across the organization pretty quickly. It also spreads to your grantees. I think this is partly why we have nonprofits coming to us with $10,000 grant requests when what they really need is $50,000, but they're just too afraid to ask for what they actually need, right? It's a poverty mentality. The fourth problem is that we have a upcoming philanthropy boom in the world. In the next 30 to 40 years, there is anticipated to be a $30 trillion, trillion with a T, transfer of wealth, generational transfer of wealth. Some portion of that will be philanthropic. It's unclear exactly what. But if that philanthropy is embracing a poverty mentality, it's going to be a lot less impactful than if it was embracing an abundance approach to the work. And the last is that funders embracing a poverty mentality, I think, are freedom wasters. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of freedom in philanthropy, and we have a lot of opportunity to be abundant and take risks and try new things because we're not accountable to a lot of people, right? And so I think when you have a poverty mentality, you're wasting that freedom that most people don't have. I mean, I was speaking recently I was in Brussels a few months ago talking to the head of an association of Russian foundations who said, you know, philanthropy is like one of our only opportunities for freedom of expression in our country, right? Because they're not in a democracy, obviously. And, you know, so you don't want to squander the opportunities that many of us have in philanthropy to create a lot of change. So if you receive the discussion guide, you have this quiz that kind of tests the extent to which you have a poverty or an abundance mentality. And it's an 8-question quiz. It will, I'm sure, come as a huge shock to you that this is not a scientifically validated survey instrument. But I'm using my own abundance approach to say that's fine because this is useful enough, I think, to give you a sense of where you are and ideas for how you could create change. And it's on a scale of 1 to 3. So for all these questions, just think about or write down your answer. If this happens to you often, put a 1. If it happens to you sometimes, put a 2. And if it happens to you rarely, put a 3. So the first question is you frequently ask yourself, and you could be you as an individual or you as an organization, however you want to answer it. You frequently ask, what's the cheapest way we can go about doing something? The cheapest way we can go about this, regardless of impact on comfort, quality, speed, whatever, right? Do you do that often? Give yourself a 1. Sometimes give yourself a 2, or rarely give yourselves a 3. The second question, you don't regularly make investments in your own or your grantees' capacity, talent, infrastructure, professional development, learning, communications, evaluation, all that kind of stuff. You don't regularly make investments in your own talent and capacity or that of your grantees, often, sometimes, or rarely. Number 3, there's a cultural value on working harder and not smarter. Working harder means things like longer hours, working on weekends, rarely taking vacation, lengthy processes for decision making, planning, et cetera, et cetera. Things take a long time. Number 4, a belief that all funds should go to the community or the grantees or people in need, right? And a corollary to that is you don't believe you deserve or you feel guilty spending money on yourselves as an organization, investing in yourself. The money all should go to the community. Number 5, you're often constrained by rules, procedures, policies, systems, and kind of, quote, the way things are done around here. It's hard for you to do anything differently because you're stuck in all these existing ways of doing business. Number 6, you feel the real problems you want to tackle are simply impossible for an organization of your size, so then you focus on much smaller goals, smaller activities that you think are more manageable, where you can actually see some change. Number 7, you know something is important to the success of your endeavor, like investing in a communications plan or funding the evaluation of something. You know that that's really critical to the success of what you're trying to do, but you never seem to have the time to focus on it or the money to spend on it, to properly resource it. And then lastly, you or your staff feel that you don't have time. You rarely have time to think or to plan or to build relationships because you're always too, quote unquote, busy. So those are my 8 questions. If you answer them all honestly on a 1 to 3 scale, again, 1 means this happens often, 2 sometimes, 3 rarely, and then just simply add them all up. The highest possible score would be a 24. That would be pure abundance or pure denial, I don't know, one of the two. The lowest score would be an 8, which is like you're entrapped in this poverty mentality and you can't escape. You know, help, I can't get up. And likely you're somewhere in between. And I would say that if you're a 22 or higher, you know, you're good. You regularly experience an abundance mindset and, you know, keep it up and keep going. If you're anywhere below 20, 21 even, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think this is a really good tool that you can use with your colleagues to have a discussion about how your score is different or were the same, and what are some changes that you can begin to make internally in your organization. I'm just going to end by sharing 5 techniques that I think are really helpful for shifting from a poverty mentality to an abundance mindset. And so the first is simply to make a mental shift. Again, this is really all a mindset. And so the good news is you can change it. You can change your mindset. I think part of it is letting go of guilt. Often this is related to feeling guilty. We don't deserve investing in ourselves. And, you know, guilt really masks talent, and it hinders us and holds us back. So figure out the source of your guilt, and then honestly, like flick it off, like make it go away, because you just need to let it go. Related, I think, recognizing that having an abundance mentality really means that you believe in your organization and what you're trying to do, and therefore you believe in your people and your systems and resourcing them, your grantees, giving them adequate resources to do the work they need to do. And then again, recognizing that a lot of this is in your control. You know, we create a poverty mentality so we can undo it. We create the bureaucracy, we can undo it. We create these beliefs, we can undo them. So part of it is making that mental shift. The second is cutting through the clutter. All that clutter that bogs us down, bogs your staff down on a daily basis. So I think you can ask yourself and your teams questions like, how much time are we spending on things that are taking us away from the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish? And then ask yourself, what kind of investments could we make to ensure that we are staying focused on our mission and keeping that work going forward as quickly as possible? Or ask yourselves, what are the internal tasks and processes that we dread the most? And then ask yourselves, what are the resources and investments we could make in changing them, getting rid of them, eliminating them, reducing them, whatever it is, to simplify our work? And the third question is asking, when do we do our best and most productive work? Like in what scenarios or under what conditions? Is it we're in the office and we're really cranking it out? Is it we're in the community and we're really having an impact? Really think about where are you most productive, and then try to figure out what are the investments we can make to ensure that we are in our most productive time most of the time, and what can we get rid of that's preventing us from being productive. The third is to conduct a force field analysis, which sounds maybe scary, but is quite fun actually. And think about, you know, what are your opposing forces and what are your supporting forces? Literally, what are the things that are opposing you and preventing you from having an abundance mindset? And like just brainstorm them. And they could be personal things. They could be professional things. So personal things could be feeling overwhelmed, feeling like you're always behind and you're always scrambling, right? Or professionally, it could be your board chair is very spendthrifty, for example. And think about what are the things we could do to minimize those opposing forces, right? How can we get our calendar in order so we don't feel overwhelmed all the time, so we have time to embrace abundance? And then what are your supporting forces? What are the things in your life or in your organization that are supporting an abundance approach? It could be things like your spouse, who is always that cheerleader for you, that tells you you're doing a great job and you could do more and go for it, right? How do you maximize your time with your spouse? And I mean that literally. Like, how do you spend more time and debrief and what's going on and engage that person or the people in your lives that are really like encouraging you to try new things, to take risks? It could be your track record of success. It could be maybe you have a new CFO in your community foundation who's really open to figuring out how do we rethink our finances in such a way that positions our foundation to be a community leader. So you might have new talent or new ideas. So again, how do you maximize your supporting forces, things that are pushing you toward abundance, and minimize the ones that are like opposing you and forcing you back? The fourth I call blue elephant. And I call it blue elephant because I think it's important to name things. So for example, naming a poverty mentality. So if you and your organization are discussing this on a regular basis, and you can come up with a little catchphrase like blue elephant or whatever it might be, something that's funny to you or just bizarre, then when you're in a meeting and somebody's exhibiting a poverty mentality behavior, you can say blue elephant. And then everyone can say, oh, is that a poverty, was that a poverty mentality? I mean, think about that. Yeah, I guess you're right. Okay, let's like halt that and figure out how do we become abundant? How do we not hold ourselves back, right? So using, I think, a catchphrase like that can actually be really helpful because it's a fun way to engage your colleagues and kind of call each other and yourselves on your poverty mentality when it manifests itself. And then the last technique is simply to make the changes. So for example, if you do this quiz and you identify some things you can try doing differently, do them differently and see what happens. Like begin to make some of these changes. If you want to be more innovative as an organization, then you need to make sure that you change the conditions in the environment in your organization that support innovation, right? Like letting everyone know that you support innovation and you want everyone to play a role in generating innovative ideas, as we talked about a few live stream episodes ago. Being consistent is part of that change, being abundant in all aspects of your life, not just your professional life, but also your personal life. And beginning to practice some of these new behaviors. Sometimes this requires like a changing the groove or the cadence of how you work. And it might take a while before practicing new behaviors and new approaches that allow you to get used to them and have that be kind of your new normal. And the last is success, not perfection. And again, just recognizing that, just try to make the change and don't worry about doing it perfectly, but try to, in every aspect of your work, embrace an abundance approach. In the for-profit world, we talk a lot about having to spend money to make money. And I think in philanthropy, we really need to recognize that we have to invest in ourselves in order to create social change. And the question, I think, is, are foundations really willing to embrace an abundance mindset and be able to create that social change? So with that, I conclude this episode. Thank you for those of you that stayed on. And I look forward to sharing this with you. I'll send you the download and some additional materials that you can review. Of course, feel free to call me. If you subscribe to the series, you're welcome to schedule a coaching call with me if you haven't already. And I look forward to having you join me on October 30th for our next and final episode on the topic of overcoming fear. Thank you.